The wind cut like razors through the rags Eleanor Fitzpatrick called a dress. Her bare feet left crimson marks in the New Mexico snow as she carried her youngest daughter in trembling arms. Behind her, Thomas, only 7 years old, held his 5-year-old sister Mary's hand. "Hey there. Thanks for being here. Leave a like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you think of the story." "Let's keep going, Mama. I'm cold," Mary whispered, her voice nearly lost. And the winds howled. Eleanor didn't answer. She couldn't. Words had frozen in her throat 3 days ago when she watched flames consume her home and saw her husband's body dragged away by Confederate soldiers. Now, she simply put one foot in front of the other, guided by a primitive survival instinct. The desert stretched endlessly before her, a white and merciless vastness that seemed to mock her determination. Her cracked lips could no longer form words of comfort for her children. She only whispered silent prayers to a God who seemed to have turned his back on them. Thomas stumbled and fell. Eleanor turned, her glazed eyes meeting the boy's. For a moment, she saw the reflection of her own despair in his small, frightened face. "Get up, my love," she managed to whisper, extending her free hand. Just a little more. But in her heart, she knew they were lost. The snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny promise of death. Eleanor's legs gave out as the fourth day dawned gray and lifeless. She collapsed into the snow, her youngest daughter still clutched against her chest. Thomas and Mary huddled beside her, their small bodies shivering uncontrollably. "Mama." Thomas's voice cracked with fear. "Mama, please get up." She tried to speak, to reassure him, but only a rasping breath escaped her lips. Her vision blurred as she looked at their faces, so young, so trusting, so utterly dependent on her failing strength. The weight of their survival pressed down on her chest. Like a stone, the baby hadn't cried in hours. Eleanor's heart lurched as she realized how still the tiny form had become. She pressed her ear to the infant's chest and felt the faint flutter of life. But it was growing weaker with each passing moment. The terrible silence of approaching death settled over them. Like a shroud. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, the lie burning her throat. "Someone will find us." But the desert remained silent, vast, and indifferent to their suffering. The wind carried no sounds of rescue, no hope of salvation. Only the endless whisper of snow against snow, and the gradual fading of her children's voices died. It was then that she heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps in snow, rhythmic and purposeful. Eleanor's head snapped up, her maternal instincts flaring despite her exhaustion. A figure emerged from behind a cluster of bare mesquite trees, moving with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known fear. Caleb Blackwood stood 30 feet away, his dark eyes taking in the scene before him with the careful assessment of a warrior, an Apache in his prime. He had been tracking deer when he'd spotted the strange marks in the snow, the desperate, erratic trail of someone fleeing. Now he found himself face to face with a white woman and 3 children on the verge of death. His hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt. But something in Eleanor's eyes, not fear, but a fierce protectiveness even in her weakness, made him pause. She pulled her children closer, her body forming a shield despite her obvious exhaustion. Even dying, she was fighting for them. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "They're just children." Caleb had seen many white settlers in his 32 years. He had fought them, avoided them, and occasionally traded with them. But he had never seen one look at him with such desperate hope mixed with absolute terror. Not for herself, but for the 3 small lives depending on her. There was something in her eyes that spoke to him in a language older than words, older than the hatred between their peoples. For a long moment, neither moved. The wind howled between them, carrying the scent of snow and approaching death. Caleb's mind raced with the implications of what he was considering. His people would not understand. Sarah, especially, would see this as betrayal of everything they stood for. The Apache had learned to trust no white face, for good reason, but As he watched Eleanor struggle to sit up straighter, saw her trying to shield her children from his sight even as her strength failed, something deep within him stirred. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since losing his own family to soldiers. Years ago, the recognition of a parent's love, raw and desperate and pure. In her face, he saw echoes of his wife's last moments. The same determination to protect what mattered most. The baby's weak cry broke the silence. A sound so fragile it seemed the wind might carry it away entirely. Caleb made his choice. Without a word, he approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Eleanor's eyes tracked his every step, but she didn't back away. She couldn't. When he knelt beside them, close enough to see the frost gathering on the children's eyelashes, he spoke in careful English learned from traders and missionaries. "You, come with me," he said simply, his deep voice cutting through the wind, "or you die here." Eleanor searched his face, looking for deception, for cruelty, for any sign of the savage she'd been taught to fear. Instead, she found something unexpected in his dark eyes: understanding. The look of someone who had also known loss, who recognized the weight she carried. In that moment, she realized he was not her enemy. He was her only hope. "My children," she managed, her voice breaking. "Please, save my children." Caleb nodded once, the gesture carrying the weight of an unspoken promise. The journey to the Apache camp took 2 days. Caleb moved through the terrain with the confidence of someone who knew every rock, every hidden spring. Eleanor stumbled beside him, her body pushed beyond its limits, but kept upright by his steady presence and the iron will that had carried her this far. He had fashioned a crude sling from strips of leather to carry her baby against his chest. Thomas and Mary took turns riding on his shoulders, their small hands gripping his long black hair. When Eleanor's legs finally gave out on the second morning, Caleb simply lifted her onto his back without a word. "Why?" Eleanor whispered against his shoulder as they crested a small hill. It was the first word she'd spoken since accepting his help. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "My son would have been his age," he said, nodding toward Thomas. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. Not pity, but recognition. They were both carrying ghosts. She pressed her face against his shoulder and said nothing more. The Apache camp materialized from the landscape like a mirage. Wickiups blended so seamlessly with the environment that Eleanor would have walked past them without noticing. But the people noticed them. A young warrior's sharp whistle cut through the air, sending a ripple of activity through the camp. By the time Caleb reached the outer edge, a crowd had gathered. Eleanor felt dozens of eyes on her as Caleb gently lowered her to the ground. She swayed on unsteady legs, instinctively pulling Thomas and Mary closer. The silence was deafening. She had never felt so exposed, so utterly foreign. An older woman with silver-streaked hair stepped forward, her weathered face stern. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her tone sharp with questions. Caleb responded calmly but firmly. Eleanor caught the sound of her name in his explanation. The debate continued around them, voices rising and falling in a language that sounded like wind and water. Eleanor watched faces, trying to read emotions that transcended words. Some seemed sympathetic, especially the women who glanced at her children with softening eyes. Others remained stone-faced. Then Sarah Blackhawk pushed through the crowd. Eleanor knew immediately that this woman was different. She moved with the fluid confidence of a warrior, commanding respect from everyone around her. Her dark eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her want to step backward. This was not mere suspicion. This was judgment. Sarah spoke directly to Caleb, her voice low but carrying clearly. Whatever she was saying, it was not a welcome. Eleanor didn't need to understand Apache to recognize opposition when she heard it. Caleb's response was equally measured but firm. He gestured toward Eleanor and her children, then placed his hand over his heart. Sarah's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or betrayal. "Mama," I'm scared, Mary whimpered, tugging at Eleanor's tattered skirt. Eleanor knelt down, gathering both children against her while keeping the baby secure. It's going to be all right, she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Herself, the argument between Caleb and Sarah intensified. Other voices joined in, the camp dividing into factions around them. Eleanor felt like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond her intended impact. Finally, an elderly man with deeply lined features and eyes that held ancient wisdom raised his hand. The camp fell silent instantly. He studied Eleanor for a long moment, taking in her bedraggled appearance, her children's frightened faces. When he spoke, his voice was like rustling leaves. He addressed Caleb first, then Sarah, then the crowd. Eleanor heard her name again, and something in his tone suggested he was making a decision that would affect them all. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly and stepped back. Caleb's shoulders relaxed slightly. The old man approached Eleanor slowly. When he was close enough to touch her, he spoke in halting English. "You stay," he said simply. "For now. But you must prove you belong here." Eleanor met his ancient eyes and nodded. She didn't fully understand what she was agreeing to, but she knew it was her only chance. As the crowd dispersed, Caleb approached her side. "That was Chief Iron Bear," he said quietly. "He has given you sanctuary." But Sarah speaks for many who question this decision. Eleanor looked toward the woman who had already marked her as a threat. Sarah stood apart, her posture radiating disapproval, and something deeper, a pain that Eleanor recognized, because she carried it herself. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. "Now you learn what it means to be Apache," Caleb said, "or you leave." Eleanor looked at the vast desert surrounding the camp. Leaving meant death, staying meant entering a world she didn't understand. But as she watched Thomas and Mary begin to relax for the first time in days, she knew there was really no choice at all. Eleanor's first night in the Apache camp was sleepless. Chief Iron Bear had assigned her a small wickiup at the edge of the settlement, close enough to be watched, but far enough to make her isolation clear. She huddled with her children on borrowed blankets, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a world she didn't understand. Thomas and Mary slept fitfully, their small bodies finally warmed for the first time in days. The baby nursed weakly, but at least she was feeding. Eleanor allowed herself a moment of relief before the weight of their situation settled back on her shoulders. At dawn, an elderly Apache woman appeared at her doorway. She was small and weathered, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. Without speaking, she gestured for Eleanor to follow. "Stay here with Mary," Eleanor whispered to Thomas. "I'll be right back." The woman led her to a stream that wound through the camp. She pointed to Eleanor's torn and filthy dress, then to the water. Making washing motions, Eleanor understood. She was being offered the chance to clean herself and her children. As Eleanor knelt by the stream, scrubbing the grime from her skin with sand and cold water, other women began to gather. They watched her with curious eyes, some whispering among themselves in Apache. Eleanor felt their scrutiny like physical weight, but she forced herself to focus on her task. When she was as clean as she could manage, the elderly woman, who Eleanor would later learn was called Grandmother Willow, handed her a simple Apache dress made of soft deerskin. Eleanor looked down at her own tattered garments, then at the generous gift. Tears pricked her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Grandmother Willow nodded and patted Eleanor's shoulder gently. It was the first truly kind gesture she received since Caleb found them in the snow. The next few days blurred together in a constant struggle to understand and adapt. Eleanor watched everything with desperate attention, trying to learn the rhythms of Apache life. She observed how the women prepared food, how they tended fires, how they cared for children. Every gesture, every routine was a lesson in survival. But Sarah Blackhawk made her disapproval known at every turn. When Eleanor tried to help with food preparation, Sarah would appear and redirect the other women away from her. When she attempted to gather firewood, Sarah would speak sharply in Apache. And suddenly Eleanor found herself alone. The message was clear. She was not welcome to participate in the life of the camp. The children adapted more quickly than Eleanor had expected. Thomas began following some of the Apache boys around the camp, his natural curiosity overcoming his initial fear. Mary, always more sensitive, stayed close to Eleanor, but watched the other children with growing interest. Even the babies seemed stronger, responding to the warmth and regular feeding. It was Caleb who finally intervened. Eleanor was sitting outside her wickiup on the fourth evening, trying to mend a tear in Thomas's shirt with inadequate thread. When he approached, he carried a bowl of stew and a piece of flatbread. "You need to eat," he said, settling beside her. Eleanor accepted the food gratefully. It was the first hot meal she'd had since arriving. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching the camp's evening routines. "Sarah believes you will bring trouble to our people," he said finally. "Will I?" Eleanor asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Perhaps," Caleb admitted. "But trouble was already coming. The soldiers, the war. It follows us whether you are here or not." Eleanor set down her bowl, her appetite suddenly gone. "She hates me. She fears you," Caleb corrected. "There is a difference." "What does she fear?" Caleb studied her face in the firelight. "That you will change things. That your presence will force choices our people are not ready to make." He paused. "That I will choose you over my duty to the tribe." The honesty in his words caught Eleanor off guard. She looked at this man who had saved her life, who continued to protect her despite the cost to himself. "Is that what you're doing?" "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I know that leaving you to die in the snow would have been wrong." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah appeared from the shadows. She spoke to Caleb in rapid Apache, her tone urgent and angry. Eleanor didn't need translation to understand that she was the subject of their discussion. Caleb responded calmly, but Sarah's voice rose. Finally, she turned to Eleanor and spoke in halting English. "You bring death," she said, her dark eyes blazing. "Soldiers will come looking. You will destroy us all." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "Then teach me to protect what you love," she said quietly. "Teach me to be useful instead of sending me away to die." Sarah's eyes narrowed, as if trying to determine whether Eleanor was sincere or simply desperate. After a long moment, she turned and walked away without another word. Caleb watched her go, then looked back at Eleanor. "You have given her something to think about," he said. "That may be more dangerous than being ignored." Eleanor began her lessons in secret, before dawn when the camp was still shrouded in darkness. She would slip away from her children's sleeping forms and find Grandmother Willow by the dying embers of the cooking fires. The old woman seemed to understand Eleanor's desperation to belong. Without words being exchanged, Grandmother Willow would whisper, pointing to a bear track in the mud. She'd say, touching Eleanor's hair. "Woman." Eleanor repeated the words carefully, her tongue struggling with the unfamiliar sounds. Each new word felt like a small victory, a step closer to understanding the world that had reluctantly accepted her. She practiced in whispers while her children slept, afraid that speaking Apache too loudly might be seen as presumption. But Sarah was watching. On the sixth morning, as Eleanor helped Grandmother Willow tend the fires, Sarah appeared like a storm cloud. She spoke sharply to the older woman, her gestures angry and dismissive. Eleanor didn't need translation to understand she was being told to stop. Grandmother Willow responded with quiet dignity, her weathered hands never pausing in their work. The exchange grew heated, drawing the attention of other women who emerged from their wickiups to watch. "What is she saying?" Eleanor asked when Grandmother Willow finally turned away from Sarah's glare. The old woman looked at Eleanor with sad eyes. She said softly. "No." Sarah stepped closer to Eleanor, her presence commanding and intimidating. When she spoke, her English was careful but cutting. "You think learning our words makes you one of us. You think speaking Apache gives you the right to belong here? Eleanor straightened, meeting Sarah's challenging gaze. I think learning your language shows respect for your people. Respect? Sarah's laugh was bitter. You know nothing of respect. You are here because Caleb's heart has made him weak, because he sees his dead son in your boy and cannot think clearly. The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. She glanced toward Thomas, who was playing with Apache children near the stream, his laughter mixing with theirs. Is that so wrong? That something good might come from our suffering. Good. Sarah's voice rose. You bring the scent of soldiers to our camp. Every day you remain. You put our children at risk. Your presence divides us when we need unity. Eleanor felt the weight of watching eyes around them. The entire camp seemed to have paused to observe this confrontation. Then teach me to be useful, she said again, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Show me how to contribute instead of just survive. Sarah studied her with calculating eyes. You want to be useful, come. Without waiting for a response, Sarah strode toward the edge of camp where several women were working with plants and roots. Eleanor followed, her heart pounding with uncertainty. The women looked up as Sarah approached, their expressions wary. Sarah spoke in rapid Apache, gesturing toward Eleanor. One woman shook her head, clearly reluctant. Another looked Eleanor up and down with obvious skepticism. Sarah picked up a bundle of unfamiliar roots and thrust them at Eleanor. These are chill. They must be prepared correctly or they will poison whoever eats them. One mistake kills a family. Eleanor took the roots with trembling hands, understanding the test for what it was. This wasn't generosity. This was Sarah giving her enough rope to hang herself. Watch carefully. Sarah continued, you will have one chance to learn. If you fail, if you prove you cannot be trusted with our ways, you will leave for the next hour. Eleanor focused with desperate intensity as Sarah demonstrated the intricate process of preparing the roots. Scraping, soaking, grinding, each step had to be perfect. The other women watched in tense silence, ready to intervene if Eleanor made a fatal error. When Sarah finally stepped back, Eleanor's hands were raw and her back ached, but she had successfully prepared the roots. The women examined her work with critical eyes before nodding grudgingly. You did not poison us today, Sarah said, her tone giving away nothing. Tomorrow we will see if you can weave baskets without cutting yourself. As Sarah walked away, Eleanor understood that this was not acceptance. It was the beginning of an exhausting trial designed to prove her inadequacy. But for the first time since arriving at the camp, she felt a spark of hope. Sarah was no longer trying to ignore her away. She was challenging her to prove herself. And Eleanor had never backed down from a challenge when her children's lives depended on the outcome. The basket weaving lesson nearly ended in disaster. Eleanor's pale fingers, still soft from her former life, couldn't master the tight weaving required for Apache baskets. The sharp grasses cut her hands repeatedly, leaving drops of blood on the pale fibers. Sarah watched with barely concealed satisfaction as Eleanor struggled. Apache women learn this as children, she said coldly. Their mothers teach them patience before they can walk. Eleanor wiped blood from her palm and continued working around her. The other women wove with fluid grace, their hands moving in patterns learned through generations. Their baskets took shape like magic while Eleanor's remained a tangled mess. Perhaps some skills cannot be taught to outsiders, Sarah observed. Perhaps some students need better teachers, Eleanor replied quietly, not looking up from her work. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Eleanor knew she had crossed a line, but desperation made her bold. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was deadly calm. Tomorrow you will hunt with the women. If you cannot provide food for the tribe, you have no value here. That evening, as Eleanor sat outside her wickiup nursing her cut hands, Caleb appeared. He carried strips of soft leather and a small pot of healing salve. Let me see, he said. Settling beside her, Eleanor extended her hands reluctantly. The cuts were deeper than she'd admitted to herself, some still seeping blood. Caleb's touch was gentle as he cleaned each wound, his large hands surprisingly delicate. "Sarah is testing you," he said as he worked. "I know." Eleanor watched his face in the firelight. "She wants me to fail. She wants to protect her people. You threaten everything she believes about keeping the tribe safe. And what do you believe?" Eleanor asked. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, focused on wrapping her hands with the soft leather. "I believe change comes whether we welcome it or not. The question is whether we let it destroy us or make us stronger." His hands lingered on hers when he finished. Eleanor felt something shift between them, a recognition that went beyond gratitude, beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. "Caleb," she began, but he shook his head. "Do not speak of what we both feel," he said quietly. "Not yet, not while your place here remains uncertain." The next morning, Eleanor joined the hunting party with a borrowed bow that felt foreign in her hands. The women moved through the desert like shadows, reading signs in the earth that Eleanor couldn't even see. They communicated in whispers and hand signals, their coordination born of years hunting together. Eleanor tried to follow their example, but her footsteps seemed thunderous compared to their silent grace. When a rabbit darted from behind a rock, she raised her bow awkwardly. The arrow went wide, striking a boulder 20 feet from the target. The women exchanged glances that needed no translation. But as they tracked deeper into the desert, Eleanor began to notice things the others missed. Growing up on a frontier farm had taught her to read the land differently. She spotted edible plants the Apache women passed by, remembered her father's lessons about finding water in dry country. When she quietly pointed out a hidden spring, the women stopped to fill their water pouches. When she identified tracks that led to a prairie dog warren, they were able to catch enough small game to make the hunt worthwhile. By evening, Eleanor had contributed more than anyone expected, though not in the way they had anticipated. The lead hunter, a stern woman named Bluebird, spoke to Sarah in rapid Apache when they returned to camp. Sarah's expression was unreadable as she listened. When Bluebird finished, Sarah approached Eleanor. "You see the land differently then." "We do," she admitted grudgingly. "This may be useful." It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't dismissal either. Eleanor sensed she had passed another test, though she suspected harder challenges lay ahead. That night, as she settled her children for sleep, Thomas looked up at her with curious eyes. "Mama, are we going to stay here forever?" Eleanor brushed his hair back gently. "I don't know, sweetheart. Would you like to?" Thomas considered this seriously. "The other boys taught me to make snares today, and Maria showed Mary how to find honey in rocks." Eleanor's heart ached at how quickly her children were adapting, how easily they were finding their place in this world that remained foreign to her. "We'll stay as long as we're welcome," she promised. But she knew that welcome remained as fragile as the threads she'd struggled to weave that morning. 3 weeks into Eleanor's stay, the stranger arrived at sunset. Eleanor was teaching Mary to identify edible roots when the camp's warning whistle pierced the air. Warriors emerged from wickiups, with weapons ready, their movements swift and coordinated. Eleanor instinctively pulled her children closer, her heart racing as memories of Confederate soldiers flooded back. But the figure that rode into camp was alone, a man in a tattered Union uniform, his horse lathered with sweat and exhaustion. Eleanor recognized the desperate look in his eyes, the hollow cheeks of someone who had been running for days. Chief Iron Bear emerged to meet the stranger, flanked by Caleb and several warriors. The man dismounted slowly, his hands carefully visible when he spoke. His voice carried the weariness of defeat. "I seek sanctuary," he said in accented English. "I have information your people might find valuable." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the man's manner, too practiced, too calculating, set her on edge. She watched as Caleb and the chief exchanged glances, their faces carefully neutral. The stranger introduced himself as Edward Harrington, a deserter from Juarez's forces. He spoke of Confederate movements, troop positions, supply lines, information that could indeed be valuable to Apache raiders. But Eleanor noticed how his eyes scanned the camp as he talked, cataloging details with military precision. It was when his gaze fell on her that Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Recognition flickered in Edward's pale eyes, followed by something that might have been satisfaction. He had seen her before, not her specifically, perhaps. But women like her, the wives and widows of Confederate soldiers, the displaced families fleeing the chaos of war. After the formal introductions, Edward was given food and a place to rest. Eleanor kept her distance, staying close to her wickiup with her children. But she could feel his attention on her like a physical weight. That evening, as the camp settled into its nightly routine, Edward approached her fired strange place for a white woman, he said conversationally, settling uninvited beside her, especially one with such young children. Eleanor didn't look up from the moccasin she was mending. These people save our lives. Did they? Edward's tone was pleasant, but there was steel beneath it. Or are you simply trading one form of captivity for another? What do you want? Eleanor asked directly. Edward was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the firelight. I know who you are, he said finally. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, wife of Captain James Fitzpatrick, Confederate cavalry. Your husband carried dispatches between Austin and Santa Fe before his unfortunate death. Eleanor's hand stilled on the moccasin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady. My husband is dead. That life is over, perhaps. But the information in his head, the routes he knew, the contacts he made, the intelligence he gathered, that doesn't die with him. Edward leaned closer. I'm sure he shared some of those details with his devoted wife. I know nothing about military matters. Edward's smile was cold. Confederate gold is still moving through these territories. Supply convoys still follow the old routes. A woman who lived in that world for 3 years would know more than she realizes. Eleanor finally looked at him, meeting his calculating gaze directly. And if I did know something, why would I share it with you? Because your new friends here are walking a dangerous line. The Apache may think they're safe in these mountains, but armies are coming. Confederate, Union, Mexican. It doesn't matter. When the soldiers arrive looking for stolen goods or escaped prisoners, they won't distinguish between Apache warriors and white refugees. The threat was clear. Though delivered with conversational ease, Eleanor glanced toward where Caleb sat, with other warriors around the central fire, their voices low as they discussed Edward's intelligence. Your children are beautiful, Edward continued, his tone shifting to something that made Eleanor's skin crawl. It would be unfortunate if their sanctuary became a target, because someone chose loyalty to savages over practical survival. Eleanor set down her mending with deliberate care. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. My children are under the protection of this tribe. If you threaten them, you'll answer to more than just me. Edward chuckled. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply observing that situations can change quickly in these uncertain times. A wise woman prepares for all possibilities. He stood and brushed dust from his uniform. Think about what I've said, Mrs. Fitzpatrick. We'll speak again soon. As he walked away, Eleanor felt the foundation of her new life beginning to crack. Edward's arrival wasn't coincidence. It was the past catching up with her, bringing dangers she had hoped to leave buried in the ashes of her former home. She looked across the camp at Caleb, who was watching her with concern in his dark eyes. In that moment, she realized how much she had to lose and how little power she had to protect it. The desert wind carried the scent of distant storms, and Eleanor knew that the real tests of her loyalty were just beginning. Eleanor didn't sleep. That night, she lay listening to her children's breathing, Edward's words echoing in her mind like a curse. Every shadow seemed to hold threats. Every sound carried the promise of danger. When dawn broke, she found Caleb waiting outside her wickiup. You are troubled, he said simply. Eleanor looked into his concerned eyes and felt the weight of her secrets crushing down on her. How could she explain that her presence might bring destruction? to everyone who had shown her kindness. How could she tell him that the man they had offered sanctuary might be the instrument of their doom? The stranger, she began carefully. Do you trust him? Caleb's expression grew thoughtful. Trust is earned slowly among my people. He offers information we need, but his eyes hold too many shadows. What kind of shadows? The kind that comes from betraying others. Caleb studied her face. Why do you ask? Eleanor wanted desperately to tell him everything. About James's military connections. About the routes and contacts Edward believed she knew. About the threats disguised as conversation. But fear held her tongue. What if Caleb decided she was too dangerous to keep? What if the tribe chose to hand her over to preserve their own safety? He makes me uneasy, she said instead. Something about him feels wrong. Caleb nodded slowly. I will watch him carefully. For 3 days, Eleanor tried to avoid Edward, but the camp was small and he seemed to appear wherever she went. His presence was like a poison spreading through her hard-won peace. She found herself jumping at shadows, constantly watching for threads that might emerge from the desert. On the 4th morning, Edward cornered her by the stream where she was washing clothes. You've been avoiding me, he said, settling on a rock nearby. That's unwise. Eleanor continued scrubbing, not trusting herself to speak. I've been talking with your Apache friends, Edward continued conversationally. Fascinating people, so trusting once you prove your value. They've already accepted me as a valuable ally. Eleanor's hand stilled in the cold water. What do you want from me? Cooperation. Nothing more. Edward's tone was reasonable, but his eyes were cold. I know your husband carried dispatches along the Butterfield route. I know he had contacts in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, even as far as California. That knowledge could be very valuable to the right people. I told you, I know nothing about that. Come now, Eleanor. May I call you Eleanor? 3 years of marriage to a cavalry officer, and you learn nothing about his work. You never overheard conversations, never saw maps, never wondered why he traveled certain routes. Eleanor pulled the wet clothes from the water with more force than necessary. My husband protected me from his military life, Edward laughed softly. How noble. But protection is a luxury you can no longer afford. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Confederate forces are regrouping in Texas. They'll be moving through these territories soon, looking for supply lines and Apache raiders. When they come, they'll want to know who's been helping their enemies. These people saved my life, and I'm trying to save it again. Edward stood, brushing dust from his pants. Think carefully. Eleanor, your new friends are brave, but they can't protect you from an entire army. I can. Eleanor watched him walk away, her heart pounding with fear and fury. She looked around the camp, at Grandmother Willow tending her cooking fire, at the children playing by the stream, at Caleb instructing young warriors in the distance. This place had become home in ways she had never expected. These people had given her children safety, given her purpose, given her hope for a future beyond mere survival. But Edward's threats hung over everything like storm clouds. Eleanor realized, with growing dread, that her choice might not be between betrayal and loyalty. It might be between the destruction of everything she had found here and the destruction of everyone she had come to love. The confrontation came at sunset on the 7th day. Eleanor was helping Mary gather kindling when Edward appeared, blocking their path back to camp. His friendly mask had finally slipped, revealing the calculating predator beneath. Time's up, he said simply. I leave tomorrow, and you're coming with me. Eleanor pushed Mary behind her, her heart racing. I'm not going anywhere. Yes, you are. Edward's hand rested casually on his pistol. You and your children. I've arranged safe passage to Confederate lines in Texas. Your cooperation buys protection. For everyone. What cooperation? Eleanor demanded, though she dreaded the answer. Supply routes. Contact names. Everything your husband shared with his loving wife during those long winter nights. Edward's smile was cold. Don't pretend ignorance. I've done my research on Captain Fitzpatrick's assignments. Eleanor felt trapped, like prey cornered by a patient hunter. And if I refuse, then I share what I know with Chief Iron Bear. How this precious refugee is actually the widow of a Confederate spy. How she's been hiding intelligence that could save Apache lives or destroy them. Edward stepped closer. Do you think they'll still welcome you when they learn the truth? Mama. Mary's small voice was frightened. What's happening? Eleanor's mind raced desperately. Edward was right about one thing. She did know more than she had admitted. James had been careful. But 3 years of marriage had revealed fragments. Names of contacts, descriptions of routes, mentions of supply caches. Information that seemed innocuous at the time, but could be deadly in the wrong hands. You have until morning, Edward said, turning to leave. Make the right choice, Eleanor. For your children's sake. That night, Eleanor sat by her dying fire, staring into the embers as her children slept. Every option led to betrayal. If she went with Edward, she betrayed the Apache who had saved her. If she stayed silent, she risked bringing Confederate soldiers down on the camp. If she confessed everything to Caleb, she might lose the only home her children had known. She was still sitting there when Caleb emerged from the shadows. You did not come to the evening meal, he said, settling beside her. Eleanor couldn't meet his eyes. I wasn't hungry. The deserter troubles you. It wasn't a question. Eleanor looked at this man who had carried her children through the snow, who had defended her against his own people, who had become something precious to her heart. Caleb. She whispered, if you learned that someone you cared about had been lying to you, what would you do? He was quiet for a long moment. That would depend on why they lied. And if the lie could hurt people you love, then I would want the truth, so I could choose how to face whatever comes. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She thought about Grandmother Willow's kindness, Sarah's grudging respect, the children who had befriended Thomas and Mary. She thought about the safety they had found here, and the danger she had brought to their door. I need to tell you something, she said finally, about who I was, about what I know. Caleb's hand found hers in the darkness. Then tell me. Eleanor took a shaking breath and began to speak. She told him about James's real work, about the routes and contacts, about Edward's demands. With each word, she felt the weight of her secrets lifting, replaced by a different kind of fear. When she finished, Caleb was silent for so long she thought he might walk away. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. This changes things, he said, but perhaps not in the way you fear. What do you mean? Caleb looked toward Edward's sleeping area. A man who threatens children and uses fear as a weapon is not someone to trust with dangerous knowledge. But the information will be safer in Apache hands than in his. Caleb stood, his decision made. Come, we must speak with Chief Iron Bear. Eleanor's heart pounded as she realized there was no turning back. The truth was out, and tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't predict. Chief Iron Bear listened to Eleanor's confession in silence, his weathered face revealing nothing. Beside him sat the tribal council, 5 elders whose combined wisdom had guided the Apache through decades of conflict. Sarah stood at the circle's edge, her expression unreadable in the firelight. Eleanor knelt in the center, her hands clasped tightly to stop their trembling. She had told them everything, James's intelligence work, the routes and contacts she remembered, Edward's threats. With each revelation, she felt her place in the tribe slipping away like sand through her fingers. When she finished, the silence stretched endlessly. Finally, Chief Iron Bear spoke. You have carried dangerous knowledge among us without speaking. Yes, Eleanor whispered. This knowledge could bring soldiers to our camp, yes. Yet you chose to reveal it now, when hiding it might have saved your life. Eleanor looked up, meeting the chief's ancient eyes. Because hiding it would have cost other lives. Lives that matter more to me than my own safety. Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp, pretty words, But her confession comes only after being cornered by the deserter. How do we know this isn't another deception? The accusation hit Eleanor like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain steady. You can only judge by what I do now. Chief Iron Bear raised his hand, silencing Sarah's response, bringing the deserter. Two warriors left the circle. Within moments, they returned with Edward, who looked annoyed at being awakened but maintained his practiced smile. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "how can I assist you at this late hour?" Chief Iron Bear gestured to Eleanor. "This woman has shared interesting information about your conversation with her." Edward's eyes flicked to Eleanor, and she saw calculation replace his casual demeanor. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "She says you threatened her children to gain intelligence about Confederate supply routes," Edward laughed, but the sound was forced. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Mrs. Fitzpatrick and I were simply discussing her difficult situation. As fellow refugees, I offered to help her reach safety among her own people by threatening to expose her past if she refused." "Certainly not." Edward's voice carried wounded innocence. "Why would I threaten someone I'm trying to help?" Eleanor felt her heart sink. Of course he would deny everything. It was her word against his, and she was the one who had admitted to lying. But Caleb stepped forward. "Then you will not object to leaving immediately tonight?" Edward's mask slipped slightly. "That seems unnecessary. If your intentions are pure, you have no reason to remain." Chief Iron Bear's voice carried quiet authority. "You have shared your intelligence. Our hospitality is complete." Eleanor watched Edward's face as he realized his position had shifted. Without her cooperation, his leverage was gone. But he wasn't finished fighting. "Of course I'll respect your wishes," he said carefully. "But I feel obligated to warn you. Confederate forces are indeed moving through this territory. When they arrive looking for deserters and stolen intelligence, they'll remember who offered them cooperation and who didn't." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Edward was essentially declaring that he would betray the camp's location if they didn't give him what he wanted. Sarah's hand moved to her knife. Perhaps this man should not be allowed to leave at all. Edward's eyes hardened. "Kill me, and my absence will be noted. I'm expected at Fort Bliss within the week." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Eleanor realized this was the moment that would define everything, not just her fate, but the safety of everyone in the camp. She stood slowly, her decision crystallizing with startling clarity. "I'll go with him," she said quietly. "Eleanor, no." Caleb's voice was sharp with alarm. Eleanor looked at him with eyes full of love and sorrow. "It's the only way to keep everyone safe. He gets what he wants, and the tribe is protected." But as she spoke the words, she was already planning something else entirely. Edward wanted her knowledge, but he had underestimated what she was willing to do to protect her new family. Some truths, she realized, were worth fighting for. And some fights required sacrifices that only a mother could understand. Eleanor's apparent surrender was a lie, and Edward fell for it completely. As dawn broke over the camp, he waited by his horse while Eleanor gathered her children and few possessions. The Apache watched in tense silence, many unable to hide their disappointment. Eleanor had won their grudging respect only to abandon them when tested. But Caleb knew better. He had seen something in Eleanor's eyes the night before, not defeat, but determination. When she caught his gaze across the camp, her slight nod confirmed his suspicions. "Ready?" Edward asked impatiently as Eleanor approached with her children. "Almost." Eleanor set down her bundle and knelt to check Thomas's shoes. The dessert is hard on little feet as she adjusted the leather ties. Her fingers found the small knife Grandmother Willow had given her for preparing roots. She palmed it smoothly, rising with practice calm. "There's something I should tell you before we leave," she said to Edward. "What now?" His irritation was cleared. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "About the supply cache near Mesilla. James mentioned it might still be active." Edward's eyes lit with greed. He leaned in to hear better, and Eleanor struck. The knife went into his shoulder rather than his heart. Her hands were shaking too badly for precision, but it was enough to send him stumbling backward, cursing and reaching for his pistol. Eleanor lunged again, this time knocking the weapon from his grasp. They crashed to the ground together, Edward's superior strength quickly overwhelming her. He pinned her wrists, blood from his shoulder dripping onto her face. "You stupid woman," he snarled. "You've just killed everyone in this camp." But Eleanor was already screaming in Apache, words grandmother Willow had taught her for emergencies. *Nalnish, *enemy, enemy. The camp exploded into motion. Warriors who had been pretending to center us suddenly surrounded them, weapons drawn. Edward found himself facing a dozen Apache fighters who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "You planned this," he gasped, looking from Eleanor to Caleb. "We knew you would betray us regardless," Caleb said calmly. "Better to control one." And how Edward's face twisted with rage and desperation. "You think this changes anything? I'm still expected at Fort Bliss. My absence will bring soldiers." "No," Chief Iron Bear said, stepping forward. "It will not." The old chief held up a leather pouch that Eleanor recognized. "Edward's dispatch case. We have learned much from your papers while you slept. About your real mission. About who sent you." Edward's face went pale. "Those are military secrets, indeed, including orders to locate Apache camps for Confederate raiders." Chief Iron Bear's voice was heavy with disgust. "You came here not seeking sanctuary, but gathering intelligence for our enemies." Eleanor struggled to her feet, Caleb's steady hand helping her stand. Her shoulder ached where Edward had pinned her, but she felt lighter than she had in weeks. "The children?" she asked. "Safe," Sarah said, appearing at her side. For the first time since Eleanor's arrival, the Apache woman's expression held something like approval. "You fought well for someone who claims to know nothing of war." Eleanor looked at Edward, now bound and surrounded by warriors who would ensure he never reached Fort Bliss. "I learned from my husband that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to fight for it." Chief Iron Bear nodded slowly. "This is wisdom that transcends the boundaries between peoples." As the camp settled back into its morning routine, Eleanor realized something had fundamentally changed. She was no longer a refugee seeking acceptance. She had become something else entirely. A member of the tribe who had proven her loyalty in the way that mattered most. She had chosen them over her own safety, and in doing so, had finally found her place among them 3 days after Edward's capture. The camp faced a new crisis. Scout riders brought word that Confederate forces were indeed moving through the territory, following the very routes Edward had described in his dispatches. The tribe had perhaps a week before they would need to abandon their winter camp. Eleanor found herself in an unexpected position, no longer an outsider seeking acceptance, but a valued member whose knowledge could save lives. Chief Iron Bear called her to council, asking her to share everything she remembered about the military routes and patrol patterns James had mentioned. "The southern pass through Eagle Mountains," she said, tracing lines in the dirt with a stick. "James said it was too narrow for large forces, but cavalry units used it to avoid detection." Caleb studied her crude map. "We could move the elders and children through there while the warriors create diversions elsewhere." Eleanor nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else. A place James called Sanctuary Springs, about 20 miles northeast. He said it was an old Apache camp that his unit never found because it was so well hidden." The elders exchanged meaningful glances. Bluebird, the woman who had led Eleanor's first hunting party, spoke in rapid Apache. Chief Iron Bear translated. "She says her grandmother spoke of such a place. Hidden valleys where our people sheltered during the worst conflicts with Mexico." "Could you find it?" Sarah asked Eleanor directly. Eleanor considered carefully. "I think so." James described landmarks, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, a stream that disappeared underground. Over the next days, Eleanor worked closely with the tribal scouts, combining her fragmentary knowledge with their intimate understanding of the land. It was during one of these planning sessions that Grandmother Willow approached her with a small beaded bracelet. *Towody*, the old woman said, placing the bracelet on Eleanor's wrist. Eleanor looked questioningly at Caleb, who had been translating. "It means hawk," he explained, "one who sees far and protects the nest." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. To receive an Apache name was more than acceptance. It was recognition that she had become part of the people's story. That evening, as the camp prepared for the difficult journey ahead, Caleb found Eleanor sitting with her children by their fire. Thomas and Mary were chattering excitedly about the adventure of moving to a secret valley, their resilience both heartbreaking and inspiring. "You have given us more than roots and hiding places," Caleb said, settling beside her. "What do you mean?" "You have shown us that survival sometimes requires trusting those who seem different." He paused, watching the firelight dance across her face. "Sarah spoke with me today. She said you fight like an Apache woman, not with hatred, but with love for what must be protected." Eleanor looked across the camp, watching families prepare for an uncertain journey. "These people saved my children when I had nothing left to give. How could I not fight for them?" "And what of Eleanor Fitzpatrick?" Caleb asked gently. "What happens to her?" Eleanor touched the beaded bracelet on her wrist, feeling the weight of her new identity. "She died in the snow with her old life. I'm Towody now." Caleb's hand found hers in the darkness. "Then Towody should know that she has a place here. Whatever comes." Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, not just gratitude or relief, but belonging. The woman who had fled through the desert in desperation had been transformed into someone who could help guide others to safety. Tomorrow they would begin the dangerous journey to Sanctuary Springs. But tonight, for the first time since losing her home, Eleanor felt truly at peace with who she had become. The exodus began before dawn, moving like shadows across the desert landscape. Chief Iron Bear had divided the tribe into 3 groups. To avoid detection, warriors with the fastest horses to create false trails, elders and children following the hidden paths, and a middle group carrying essential supplies. Eleanor traveled with the families, her children absorbed into the protective circle of Apache mothers who treated them as their own. She marveled at how efficiently the tribe moved, leaving barely a trace of their passage. Every step was deliberate, every pause calculated to avoid skylines and open ground. On the second day, Eleanor's knowledge proved crucial. They reached a rocky plateau where 2 valleys diverged, and the scouts were uncertain which path to take. Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to remember James's descriptions of the terrain near Sanctuary Springs, the left valley. She said finally, James mentioned how the wind sounded different there, like it was being funneled through narrow spaces. As they descended into the valley, Eleanor's heart raced with uncertainty. What if she was wrong? What if her memories had led them into a trap? But after 3 hours of careful progress, Bluebird pointed ahead with excitement. There it was, the rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, exactly as James had described. Beyond it, hidden by a clever turn in the canyon walls, lay a green valley fed by springs that bubbled up from deep underground. Sanctuary Springs. Eleanor whispered, using both languages that had become part of her. The hidden valley was even more perfect than she had imagined. Natural cave formations provided shelter. The springs offered fresh water, and the narrow entrance could be easily defended or concealed. Most importantly, it was large enough to sustain the entire tribe through the dangerous months ahead. As the Apache families began setting up temporary shelters, Eleanor found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished. This wasn't just survival. It was the preservation of an entire way of life. "You did this," Caleb said, joining her as she watched children play by the clear pools. "We did this," Eleanor corrected. "Your people trusted knowledge from outside their tradition. That's not a small thing." That evening, Chief Iron Bear called the tribe together for a ceremony of gratitude. Eleanor was surprised when he asked her to stand before the assembled families. Tawodi has guided us to safety, he announced. She has proven that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, and that courage is not bound by the circumstances of birth. The old chief placed his hands on Eleanor's shoulders. You came to us broken, seeking only survival for your children. You leave the ceremony as one who has helped ensure survival for all our children. Eleanor felt the weight of belonging settle around her like a warm blanket. Sarah approached, offering her a necklace of turquoise and silver, a gift that spoke of full acceptance from someone who had once seen her as a threat. But it was the look in Caleb's eyes that moved her most. Not gratitude or respect, but something deeper, the recognition of a partner, an equal, someone who had earned her place not through desperation, but through choice. As the stars emerged over Sanctuary Springs, Eleanor realized she had found something she had never expected to possess again, a future built on hope rather than mere survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. The woman who had once been Eleanor Fitzpatrick had truly become Tawodi, and in doing so had helped an entire people find their way home. 6 months later, Sanctuary Springs had become more than a refuge. It had become home. Eleanor stood at the valley's edge, watching Thomas practice with a bow under the patient guidance of Apache boys, who had become his brothers. His laughter echoed off the canyon walls, a sound that would have seemed impossible during those desperate days in the snow. Mary sat nearby weaving grass dolls with the other girls, her small fingers now nimble with traditional Apache crafts. The baby, no longer quite so small, crawled fearlessly among the children. Treated as a beloved member of the extended family, she had learned to speak her first words in Apache, calling grandmother Willow Shima grandmother, with the same E she called Eleanor Mama . You are content, Caleb said, approaching from behind. Eleanor turned to face the man, who had become so much more than her rescuer. Over the months, their friendship had deepened into something neither had expected, but both had grown to treasure. More than content, she replied. I feel complete. Caleb studied her face, noting the peace that had replaced the haunted look she'd carried when he first found her. The woman who had once clutched her children in desperate terror now moved through the valley with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged. The council has made a decision, he said. Eleanor felt a flutter of old anxiety. About what? About us. Caleb's eyes held warmth and something deeper. They have given their blessing for an Apache marriage ceremony, if you are willing. Eleanor's breath caught. Marriage had seemed like something from her old life, a connection to Eleanor Fitzpatrick that no longer fit. But this, a union blessed by tradition, recognized by the community that had become her world, felt like the natural completion of her transformation. And Sarah, Eleanor asked, knowing the woman's opinion still carried weight. Sarah believes that love which makes the tribe stronger should be celebrated, regardless of where it begins. Eleanor looked across the valley at the life they had built. Together, the Apache had not just survived in this hidden sanctuary, they had thrived. Children learned traditional skills while adults adapted new knowledge. The blending of Eleanor's outside perspective with Apache wisdom had created something richer than either could achieve alone. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, that evening, as the tribe gathered around the central fire, Chief Iron Bear stood to make an announcement. The marriage of Caleb and Tawodi would take place at the next full moon, uniting the people whose love had already strengthened the entire community. As the celebration began, Eleanor felt arms encircle her from behind. Her children, all three of them now calling Caleb Shida my father, pressed close with excitement about the coming ceremony. Are you happy, Mama? Mary asked, her dark eyes serious. Eleanor looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight, faces that had become family, voices that had taught her new songs, hands that had helped her build a life from ashes. Happier than I ever thought possible, she said truthfully. Later, as the fire died to embers and the valley settled into peaceful quiet, Eleanor and Caleb walked to their favorite spot overlooking the springs. The same stars that had witnessed her desperate flight through the snow now shone down on a woman who had found not just survival, but joy. No regrets, Caleb asked softly. Eleanor considered the question, thinking of the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Eleanor Fitzpatrick had died in that blizzard, her whole life consumed by loss and war. But from that ending had emerged Tawoti, a woman who belonged to this place, these people, this love. None, she said, and meant it completely. The desert wind carried the sound of sleeping children and the gentle murmur of springs that would flow forever, blessing this hidden valley where broken things could become whole again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.